And now, ladies and gentlemen, you've seen her earlier, but this time I'd like to invite the Deputy Executive Director of IEA back up on stage to share with us a very interesting perspective, and that of Southeast Asia launch of IEA's World Energy Outlook. Ms. Wallach, thank you.
Thank you very much, and let me just begin by thanking the two ministers for your very valuable and encouraging keynote addresses. We greatly appreciate the leadership that you, both of your countries and Singapore, of course, and other countries in ASEAN are providing for the clean energy transition in this region. And certainly take on board the important message you've just conveyed with regard to the great importance of international collaboration on this journey going forward. So turning to the World Energy Outlook 2021, I'm very pleased to have the opportunity to present this to you today. I think many of you know that each year the IEA produces a WEO, which explores where the world is heading based on policies governments have committed to, as well as trends we see in the energy sector. And this year's WEO shows three main scenarios. First, the stated policy scenario. These are policies that countries now have in place. Second, the announced pledges scenario, so the expected impact of newly announced but not yet implemented policies that countries have made on climate. And third, the net zero scenario, a narrow but achievable scenario to net zero and a 1.5 degrees Celsius world by mid-century. This is a report that was published by the IEA in May of 2021. So this special edition of the WEO looks at where the world is heading and how this changes if countries meet all their announced pledges, and how the world can keep the door to 1.5 degrees Celsius open following the IEA's landmark net zero by 2050 roadmap, and the opportunities and benefits that lie along the way, as well as the implications, of course, for energy security. And what is absolutely clear is that climate ambitions have never been higher, but the energy and emissions data does not yet match the rhetoric. Over the last 20 years, global CO2 emissions have risen substantially. Cumulative emissions since pre-industrial times have warmed the Earth by more than 1 degree. Before 2015, we were on track for emissions growth out to 2050, leading to a catastrophic level of warming of around 3.5 degrees in 2100. And since the Paris Agreement, the energy sector is very different. New policies and technologies mean our temperature projections to 2100 are now down by almost 1 degree, from 3.5 degrees Celsius to 2.6 degrees. But this is still well above the temperature goal of the Paris Agreement, and without substantially scaling up our ambitions, we are facing what could be unacceptable risks. In the last year or so, countries accounting for up to 70% of global emissions have announced net zero targets, and almost 120 countries that have announced new policy ambitions account for slightly more than half of global emissions. If these are implemented in full, this would lead to a substantial change in our current emissions trajectory. And if these announced pledges are fully implemented, 2030 would mark the first time since the Industrial Revolution that fossil fuel emissions ended the decade lower than they started. And this would put the world within striking distance of the temperature goal of limiting warming to below 2 degrees Celsius. Despite the potential progress that we can make based on announced pledges, there is still a substantial gap to limit temperature increase to 1.5 degrees Celsius. These new pledges are laudable, but close only 20% of the gap between our current trajectory and a net zero pathway. And this leaves an ambition gap of almost 14 gigatons of greenhouse gases in 2030, or nearly the entire emissions of the OECD in 2019. In the longer term, by 2050, these new pledges close about 40% of that gap, but that still leaves us with the risk of hitting irreversible climate tipping points like sea level rise and acidification, as well as other major environmental crises. And meeting the Paris Agreement's objective of limiting warming to 1.5 degrees requires reaching net zero emissions by 2050. And without global concrete commitments now to reach net zero by 2050, we will lock in emissions and we will not make sufficient progress in innovation in clean energy technologies to get us there. Based on our current trajectory, we see energy demand growing, with the next decade looking much like the last. Global oil demand rebounds and grows steadily to 2030 before peaking in the mid-2030s, while natural gas continues its strong growth. Output from solar PV and wind triple over the next decade, meeting 3/4 of global electricity demand growth. But if announced climate and energy policies are implemented, they reshape global energy markets already in this decade. Oil demand would peak by 2025 and flatten, mostly because of a shift to electric vehicles. Natural gas demand grows to 2025, but flattens as well, with most demand from the power sector being picked up by renewables. And bearing in mind this is a global analysis, there are strong regional differences to consider. We understand that. Developing economies continue to see their total energy demand growing, and this growth is equally split between fossil fuels and cleaner sources. Growth in fossil fuel use in emerging market and developing economies is more than offset, however, by the decline in advanced economies. And advanced economies see their total energy demand declining, with a higher role for renewables and low-carbon sources that gain market share. The good news is that we have the policies and technologies to close the ambition gap. The WEO shows that we can close almost half of the 2030 ambition gap with cost-effective technology measures and the right enabling conditions. And we estimate that 60% of the additional power generation from wind and solar required could be achieved cost-effectively, allowing 350 gigawatt of new coal additions to be avoided, and facilitate the retirement of an additional 150 gigawatt of coal without threatening either electricity security or prices. And more than half a gigaton of additional emissions reductions could be achieved through other cost-effective measures in the power sector, in particular hydropower expansion in emerging markets and developing economies, and lifetime extensions for already online nuclear facilities is also a part of this. Reducing methane emissions from fossil fuel operations is a major low-hanging fruit that could reduce about 1.7 gigaton of CO2 emissions through measures that are technically feasible and well known. And energy efficiency, the first fuel, provides major opportunities to reduce emissions cost effectively. We estimate that end-use efficiency could provide another 1 gigaton of cost-effective reductions through the strengthening of fuel economy standards, particularly in trucks, appliance performance standards, and industrial energy efficiency. The other 60% of reductions comes from a combination of energy efficiency, demand reductions, and investments in technologies such as hydrogen, advanced batteries, CCUS, and advanced biofuels. And enhancing the near-term deployment of these known technologies can spur innovation and accelerate the deployment of complementary enabling infrastructure. And this, in turn, can allow these technologies to play a much larger role in the longer term after 2030. The WEO also touches upon an important consideration for global economic flows, the trade in energy-related commodities. Energy commodity trade is currently mainly oil, but as clean energy transitions accelerate, the IEA is shifting to track trade in critical minerals. Countries' announced pledges will have an impact on all energy trade flows. Oil will keep a dominant position, but major importers, including the European Union and China, cut their consumption and imports over time. And by 2050, well over half of total oil trade goes from the Middle East to developing countries in Asia. And this will reconfigure political relationships around oil and energy. But there are also some new commodities, including low-carbon hydrogen, that come into play. Wide variation in costs of production and transportation of hydrogen should create incentives to trade as countries move toward net zero emissions. As a result, we start to see exports of hydrogen and hydrogen-rich fuels such as ammonia, notably from Australia, some countries in the Middle East and Latin America. And if all countries commit to net zero by 2050, the current dynamics of international energy-related trade are completely overturned. The combined share of hydrogen and critical minerals in international trade reaches 80%, and rising demand for lithium, nickel, cobalt, copper, and rare earth metals opens new opportunities for key regions, particularly here in Southeast Asia. Trade patterns, producer policies, and geopolitical considerations are going to change dramatically as the world shifts toward an electrified, renewables-rich energy system. For many years now, the WEO has warned of a potential mismatch between investment in oil and gas supply and investment in clean energy technologies. Oil and gas upstream investment is now half of what it was in 2014, but oil and gas demand, even with the effects of the pandemic, has not changed as much. In practice, investment in oil and gas since last year is broadly aligned with the near-term investment amounts that we projected in a net zero pathway. A key consideration, though, is that sharp reductions in fossil fuel demand translate to no new fields approved after 2021. Across 2020, investment in clean energy technologies and related infrastructure was resilient, and we expect there to be a slight uptick this year. But we need clean energy investment to more than triple. The bottom line is that substantially more clean energy investment is essential to maintain reliable energy supply, if and while oil and gas investment remains stable or declines along with demand. And I'd just like to take a moment to make the point that today's energy market turbulence is not due to clean energy transitions or climate policies. The investment mismatch, in our view, is a major risk for the future, and a major boost in clean energy investment across all technologies and all markets is essential. Investing in clean energy now is one of our best defenses against market volatility and is a precondition for successful climate action. Turning to the new global energy economy, the transformation of the energy sector is motivated by the fight against climate change, but also the huge commercial, industrial, and employment gains for those that make the leap to the new global energy economy. If the world gets on track for net zero emissions by 2050, then the cumulative market opportunity for manufacturers of wind turbines, solar panels, lithium-ion batteries, electrolyzers, fuel cells is estimated at $27 trillion. In a net zero pathway, these 5 equipment markets alone fuel cells, electrolyzers for hydrogen, battery packs, wind turbines, and solar PV modules would be of comparable size to today's oil market by mid-century, creating enormous prospects for companies that are well-positioned along a growing set of global supply chains. There are opportunities in a range of other areas, too. In a much more electrified system, there are major openings for new fuel suppliers, for example, of low-carbon gases. And we estimate that almost 30 million new clean energy jobs are created in our net zero scenario to 2030, far more than the jobs lost in declining sectors. So despite this promising outlook, we want to emphasize that energy transitions must be inclusive and leave no one behind. Ensuring that people and communities can maintain their livelihoods and flourish in the new energy economy is one of the reasons we are helping the Global Commission for Inclusive People-Centered Energy Transitions, which I should mention has just released, as of yesterday, its report and recommendations. I very much urge you to take a look at that. So just in conclusion here, the transition to a sustainable energy system is a prime strategy against the turbulence that we're seeing in gas, coal, and electricity markets today, not the cause. We will need a laser-like focus on a handful of high-impact activities that can help close the gap, the near-term gap, with the 1.5 degrees Celsius future. We need to massively scale up clean energy investment, as the longer today's mismatch in energy investment persists, the greater the risk of future price volatility and delayed climate action. But these changes and challenges bring on a massive new opportunity. A new global energy economy is emerging, one that will be more electrified, efficient, digitalized, and clean, offering enormous potential for growth and jobs. Governments have unrivaled capacity to transform the energy sector, to set policy, regulation, and incentive, and to drive investment. And energy transitions depend on many groups of stakeholders. So we look forward to an unmistakable signal coming from governments at COP26 in Glasgow. Thank you very much for your time.
Thank you very much, Ms. Wallach, for sharing.